This time on Journeys, we're in the far southwest of Cumbria, beginning a journey along one of Britain's forgotten coastlines. The scenery is stunning, yet it conceals an industrial landscape inextricably linked with coal, iron and steel, and in more recent times, the controversies of the nuclear industry. Along the way, we'll witness deserted beaches, a rugged coastline which reaches to the edge of the track, and the magnificent hills on the western edge of the Lake District. And there's a glimpse of the beautifully restored, narrow-gauge, steam-powered Raven Glass Railway, which we'll visit in another programme. As we leave the station, we pass by the modern-looking brick-built Barrow and Furness signal box, running on what was the Furness Railway. We're heading northwest at the moment, and the original Barrow station was on a line to our right which terminated in the town. The Furness Railway was built in 1846, primarily to carry ore and minerals from the mines in Furness to Barrow docks, and to what became the largest steel-producing plant in the world. Passengers were of secondary importance in those early days. This part of the line is known as the Barrow Loop. There's a short section of less than a mile which connects the line from Lancaster in the east to the line north to Whitehaven and beyond. The Barrow Loop takes a nearly 9-mile detour around the town to reach the site of the current station before rejoining the northbound line once more. The overbridge carries Devonshire Road, named after the Duke of Devonshire, one of the people behind the building of the Furness Railway. At the time he was Earl of Burlington and had extensive interests in slate quarries north of here. To our left we begin to get a hint of what lies ahead, with the mighty 600-metre-high Black Combe set on the horizon behind the sands of the Duddon estuary. We'll be crossing the estuary just beyond Foxfield in about 20 minutes, and Black Combe will be both a presence and an obstacle in our path until Bootle, which is about 40 minutes from here. Ahead on the left is Sowerby Wood. Henry Schneider had a home here. He was one of the founders of this railway, and when he was chairman of the Barrow Steelworks, he lived at Bellsfield House on the shores of Windermere. He'd leave home each morning, having breakfast on his steam yacht as it crossed the lake to the station at Lakeside. From there, he'd travel to his office in the luxury of a private coach. Schneider was a controversial character. He was MP for Lancaster for a while, but was disqualified from office when it was shown that he'd bribed voters. His steam yacht is preserved at the Windermere Steamboat Museum and was the basis for Captain Flint's houseboat in Arthur Ransom's book Swallows and Amazons. Look left after the crossing and you may catch sight of the first of our branch lines. This line connected with the Sandscale iron ore mine a mile to the north. The seam was worked out in 1905 and the shaft covered in 1937, so there's little sign now of the previous activity there. Today, the bustle of industry has given way to the tranquility of a nature reserve, which is a part of the Duddon Estuary Special Protection Area. Also on the left, you can see the first of many wind farms we'll pass close to on our journey. The Cumbria coast is a popular spot for sighting them, both on and offshore. The junction at the end of the Barrow Loop is a minute ahead now, and we'll turn north towards our first stop at Askham, which is 5 minutes away. While we're on the platform there, we'll take a look at the map of our journey to give a taste of the landscape and seascape we'll pass by on our close to 90-minute journey. Whitehaven may only be 32 miles away as the crow flies, but our circuitous route around the estuary and Black Combe makes the journey much longer. And Askham is a place where it will be worth reflecting on the changes which have taken place around here in the last 100 years. The broken rock face of Goldmire Quarry has come into sight, and the town of Dalton and Furness lies just behind it. Goldmire is a limestone quarry and owes its existence to the steel industry. Originally owned by the Milham and Askham Hematite Iron Company, it supplied limestone, an integral part of the steelmaking process, to furnaces in Askham and Milham. We exit the Barrow Loop and begin to head north. This railway very nearly became the West Coast main line between England and Scotland. George Stephenson surveyed a route through the Furness Peninsula in 1837, completing the journey from Lancaster to Carlisle and back and writing his report in an astonishing 2 weeks. He proposed a 10-mile embankment across Morecambe Bay from Poulton Le Sands, a long tunnel under Lindle Moor to our right, which would emerge ahead near Askham, and another embankment across the Dutton Estuary. His railway would have changed the landscape here forever, reclaiming 39,000 acres from the sea. But it would be hugely expensive to build, and the Parliamentary Commission decided in May 1840 to give the go-ahead to a route over Shap Summit, which was 26 miles shorter and considerably cheaper. But the idea of a crossing of the Dutton lived on, and work began on the southern end of an embankment at Askham. The earthworks can still be seen there, extending 600 yards out from the shore. Askham is more properly Askham and Arleth, with the railway dividing the two small communities. Askham is the newer, having been established in the 19th century with the arrival of the iron and steel industry. Arleth dates from Viking times, and its name means Hill of the Irish in Norse. It stood on an important crossroads, and Marsh Lane, which ran to the west, led to the treacherous crossing over the Dutton Estuary, accessible with care only at low tide. Askham may have lost out when its major industry closed, but the village has taken on a new role. It's now a dormitory settlement for those working south in Barrow and north at the Sellafield nuclear complex. And we'll see new housing on our left ahead, which has been built to meet a demand from those who want to live amongst the beautiful scenery. Askham Station is just half a mile ahead now, and we've begun to slow for our approach. There's another population of this area today which is of huge national importance. The natterjack toad is one of just 3 protected amphibians in the UK, and a fifth of the total population lives around here. There's little left of Askham's industrial past now. There were once 4 furnaces here, and a row of terraced houses to our left stand on Steel Street. The slag banks left behind by the miners have now become important sites for wildlife. We're now 10 minutes into our journey, and this is Askham Station. While we're at the platform, let's take a look at the journey ahead. We'll cross the Dutton Estuary just after Foxfield and then travel along its northern shore to Milham. From there we skirt the flanks of Blackcomb, past the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway at Ravenglass, and strike north past Sellafield to our destination in the harbour town of Whitehaven. We've a limited time available to us for this journey, so let's jump forward a few miles to the approach to Foxfield, just short of the all-important crossing of the Dutton Estuary. To the right you can see the narrow main road north from Barrow and Furness to Whitehaven, as both road and railway squeeze between a small hill and the estuary. And then we're onto the platform. To the right is the old station building with a water tower beyond. The original station was rebuilt in 1879 to a design by Lancaster architects Paley and Austin, who designed many of the stations on the Furness Railway. By then the company had taken over both the Whitehaven and Furness Junction Railway and the Coniston Railway. If you look ahead between the tracks now, you'll see 2 parallel bars. These are used to tie 4 sleepers together in an expansion joint in the continuous welded track. When the rails are laid, they're pre-stressed to avoid buckling during hot summers. But every so often there's an additional safeguard in the form of an expansion joint, and you may just be able to see that the steel is split at a shallow angle to allow for movement when it heats up. Keep a lookout and you'll see a number of these as we go along. You'll hear the thud of the doors closing, and in a moment we'll be off from Foxfield heading for the crossing of the Duddon estuary. And beyond that we'll be stopping at Green Road before we reach the town of Milham. As we pull away from the platform, the triangular area on the right between us and the main road is where the line to Coniston branched off. Although it began life as a method for transporting copper from mines up the valley, it later became a tourist line and did much to improve access to the southwestern area of the Lake District. The line was proposed by John Barraclough Fell, who went on to invent the Fell-inclined rail system, a safety feature of mountain railways. It opened in 1859, though the Coniston station buildings weren't completed until the end of the year, and a further extension to the copper mines opened in 1860. By 1930, 10 trains a day were running on the line, and twice-weekly direct services were introduced from Blackpool. The line speed rises to 50 miles an hour now that we've rounded the tight curve out of Foxfield, and the Duddon Viaduct is 600 yards ahead. After we pass through this cutting, the journey across the sands begins and ends on an embankment. This is one of 2 estuary crossings on our journey, the other is ahead at Ravenglass, and 4 in total on the full length of the old Furness Railway, the others being across the Kent estuary and the Cartmel Sands. The viaduct is short at a little over 100 yards, and we're quickly across. As with the others, the use of embankments makes the viaduct section much shorter than it otherwise would be, and reduces the maintenance required. The viaduct is always seen as a weak point of the rail system. Just to the right of the track, we can see the steeple of St. George's Church against the background of the sky, showing that Milham is getting close. The church was built from 1874, with half of the cost being met by Milham Ironworks. The late date of the build is an indication of how recent a community this town is. When the Whitehaven and Furness Junction Railway arrived in 1850, their station was called Holborn Hill Halt. The town simply didn't exist. The railway kicked off the Industrial Revolution here, and the first shafts were sunk to access iron ore between here and the sea during that decade. And by 1881 there were 7 pits in operation. The Milham and Askham Iron Company built the first furnaces in 1866, the year the Furness Railway acquired the line. By the turn of the century there had been an influx of workers, and the new town of Milham had been established. But just as the town had flourished with the opening of an industrial base, its fortunes were to take a downturn when iron production ceased. After the mines and the ironworks closed in 1968, the population plummeted by 30% in 3 years. As we leave the station, we pass under the overbridge, and Milham's signal box is on the right. It's an unusual wooden design, but it's not the original. This one replaced the 1891 box, which was destroyed in an unfortunate shunting accident in 1913. But if the Milham box appears unusual, wait until you see 2 of those up ahead, where the frame and levers are situated outside in the open air. We quickly pick up our pace before passing a 45-mile-an-hour line speed restriction for the curve ahead. The view to our left was very different 100 years ago. This was the site of the Milham Ironworks and the mines at Hodbarrow. It was also the point where the most ambitious plan to build a viaduct across the Duddon estuary would have made land. For 140 years, the industrial complex brought prosperity to Milham. The quality of the ore here was particularly high, but the best of it lay towards the sea. So a barrier was built to protect the workings from the waves, and it's still there today. However, the sea has been allowed to flood the area within it, and it's now run by the RSPB as a wildlife sanctuary. Line speed returns to 60 miles an hour, and the peak of Great Knot, an outlier of Black Combe, appears on the right. Our next station is Silecroft, and we'll be there in 3 minutes. It's a small village, and the station is another request stop. Nearby are the equally small communities of Haverig and Kirksanton, the latter hinting at the area's past connections with the Vikings and sharing a name with a similarly small parish on the Isle of Man just across the water. Haverig was the site of RAF Milham, and its runways can still be seen. It was here that the RAF's Mountain Rescue Team was established during the Second World War, moving shortly afterwards to RAF Cork, a few miles along the coast to the east. You can see another of the area's many wind farms on the site. The first phase, consisting of 5 turbines, was one of the first developments in the UK, and ideally suited to this sometimes windy but sparsely populated area. However, there is a part of Haverig which has a much higher population, though you won't see them out and about much. More than 600 prisoners are accommodated here at Her Majesty's Prison Haverig, which was established in 1967. Look out now for the signal box on the left at the crossing. It's one of 2 on this stretch of line which looks nothing like the traditional box. The green cabin provides shelter for the signalman, but the levers for the signals are situated outside of the box by the line side. The signalman's role is to protect the level crossing and to open and close the manual gates to stop the traffic. The second of the pair is here on the right. We're just a minute off Silecroft now, and the bulk of Black Combe has appeared on the right. It's the closest we get to the Lakeland Hills. The rounded shape, so similar to the Howgills further east, is underpinned by dark grey slate laid down 400 million years ago. Black Combe lies at the southwestern edge of a ridge which leads to Harter Fell, and to the north only Hartnott Pass separates the group from the Lake District's highest peaks of Scafell and Scafell Pike. Silecroft station appears ahead, and the driver sounds a warning of our impending arrival for anyone wanting to travel north. On the right is the old goods shed, but there's little else visible of the original station. Today the platforms are adorned by modern glass waiting areas, but they're empty. We're only stopping to allow passengers off. Let's take another opportunity to jump forward in time to a spot where 3 rivers empty the rainfall from the Western Lake District into the Irish Sea, and in doing so change the nature of the sandy coastline where water meets land. The horizon ahead is changing. We're heading roughly north at the moment, but at Ravenglass we'll have turned northwest to follow the coast and avoid the peaks of the Western Lake District. Scafell Pike is one of those peaks we can see on the right. We're approaching the Ravenglass estuary now, where the rivers Mite, Urt and Esk meet the sea. We'll pass over 2 viaducts before we reach the northern side and the station. Ravenglass was an important harbour in Roman times, and the remains of the bathhouse and the fort are amongst the tallest Roman remains in Britain. Our 3-mile straight is at an end, and as we curve right to make the first crossing, a wall on the left is the only remaining evidence of Eskmeals station. Then we're onto the viaduct over the River Esk. It parallels us on the left for a mile before it joins the Urt and Might and then curves back south to the sea. We'll cross the Might shortly after we leave Ravenglass and the Urt shortly before we arrive at the following station at Drigg. We're a mile from the platform and the train begins to slow. On a hill to the right is Muncaster Castle, owned by the Pennington family for 800 years. Muncaster claims responsibility for a small part of our language. Its last court jester in the 16th century was Thomas Skelton. Although he was employed to make people laugh, he was an unpleasant character and would direct visitors he didn't like the look of towards the quicksands nearby. But what he lacked in charm was made up for by his reputation as an entertainer, and we still refer to pranks today as tomfoolery. As we approach the platform, there's an interesting sight to our right. Alongside the station is the terminus of the narrow-gauge Ravenglass and Eskdale steam railway, better known as Laurati. And in their parallel siding is a miniature passenger train awaiting renovation. The four carriages are not unlike London Underground trains, and ahead of them is a series of goods wagons connected to a miniature diesel engine. Laurati is a hugely popular destination for railway enthusiasts, and you can even buy through tickets from the Cumbria coastline. The line was originally built to a 3-foot gauge and was used to transport iron ore from the mines up the valley. Opening in 1875, it carried passengers from the following year, becoming the first public narrow-gauge railway in England. But it closed in 1913, having previously been declared bankrupt. However, 2 years later, a pair of model makers converted the Ratty to 15-inch gauge, and that's how it remains today, taking tourists on a 7-mile-long trip up the Esk Valley. As we depart Seascale, Sellafield is our next stop, and the contrast between the two couldn't be greater. We leave the tranquil beauty of a Victorian seaside resort and enter a world whose roots lie in conflict. We've already heard that there was once a munitions factory there, but at the end of the Second World War, Britain had seen the power of the atomic bombs dropped by the Americans on Japan. And politicians here were determined not to be left behind in the arms race. So the Windscale site was established to produce plutonium for Britain's atomic weapons. And one of the 400-foot-high chimneys which stood above the reactor piles can still be seen today. The top is very distinctive, housing a large filter gallery designed to catch any radioactive particles escaping from the piles below. They were a late addition to the design by Sir John Cockcroft and became known as Cockcroft's Follies. But even though they were built on the basis of a misunderstanding by Cockcroft, the filter on number 1 chimney saved West Cumbria from a major disaster when the pile caught fire in October 1957. This end of the site by then had become home to the world's first commercial nuclear power station on the Calder Hall site, named after the River Calder, which we'll pass over in a moment. The station has now been decommissioned and its cooling towers demolished. But Calder Hall was an example of how Britain once led the way in new technologies, in much the same way that it did with the railways. You can see the Windscale pile chimney in the middle of the screen, about to disappear behind the mound. Further north on the site are the storage and recycling buildings. This is a more controversial part of the Sellafield business and involves taking spent fuel from UK and overseas reactors. Much of the overseas material is brought into Barrow docks and transported to Sellafield by train, and it gives this line we're travelling on great strategic importance. We're now crossing the River Calder, which gave its name to the Calder Hall power station. And on the left is the River Ian, which meets the Irish Sea at the same point as the Calder. But the Ian will parallel us for a couple of miles before disappearing inland, influenced by the same interaction with the sea which affects the River Esk behind us. To the right are the Sellafield sidings, where trains carrying nuclear waste and fuel are loaded and unloaded. The speed limit will drop to 30 miles an hour in a moment, and for the first time since we left Barrow-in-Furness, we'll be presented with a signal set at danger, which prevents us going further. The platform at Sellafield is crowded, and there are more passengers waiting here than at any station so far. A shift at the plant has just ended. The railway provides a convenient mode of transport for workers here. It's no accident that the site was built in a remote spot, and although some of the roads have seen improvements, when shifts change, they're simply unable to cope with the traffic. In particular, the road over the fells, which provides a shortcut to Cockermouth and on to Carlisle, is very narrow, but extremely busy. And for many who commute from Carlisle, the train provides a significantly more pleasant travelling experience. And so we come to a halt at Sellafield Station. The island platform is unusual on this line, loading and unloading passengers from the right. But it only gives access to northbound trains. The southbound side is fenced off for protection. Ahead is the signal set at danger, and the Sellafield signal box is opposite it at the end of the platform. Beyond the signal box is what appears to be a bridge over the line. This carries a pipeline which is used to discharge material into the Irish Sea. It's been the subject of controversy over the years and is responsible for the discovery of radioactive material as far away as Scandinavia. In 1983, a 10-mile stretch of beach from St. Bees to Eskmules was closed after a release of radioactive material. At one stage, Greenpeace, in a highly publicised event, attempted to block the pipeline. Finally, the southbound train approaches the platform. This is the Carlisle to Barrow-in-Furness service, although 2 or 3 trains a day complete the full trip from Carlisle to Lancaster and back. But instead of coming directly to the platform, the train stops at the signal box. So what's going on? Well, it's all part of the procedure for making sure that passage through the single-track section ahead can be accomplished safely. The last thing we want to do is to meet a train coming the other way. So, to ensure that only one train is on the single-track section at a time, a system involving tokens was introduced. These are usually physical devices handed to the driver by the signalman, and a number of developments of the token system have taken place over the years. In 1876, the chairman of the London and South Western Railway blamed slow journey times between London and Exeter on the token, saying that when a train arrived to enter a single-track section, if the token wasn't there, a man had to be sent on a horse to the far signal box to collect it. The signal is raised now that the points beyond have been set in our favour, and we begin to move away from the platform. But before we can enter the single-track section, we'll need to collect the token from the signalman, and only then can we be on our way. He's waiting for us on a platform at the far end of the signal box, and our driver carefully brings us to a halt and goes across to the right side of the cab to collect it. A moment later he's back, and we can see that the token is a large key which he puts on the control panel in front of him before throttling up the engines and finally releasing the brakes. Then we're off towards our next stop at St. Bees in about 10 minutes. Between here and there we pass the old junction with the Whitehaven, Cleator and Egremont Railway, 2 request stops at Braystones and Nethertown, and what is arguably the most beautiful section of our journey as we travel along the shoreline, at times just a few feet from the high water mark. And we'll also see how susceptible this track is to water damage when we cross the site of a recent derailment caused by subsidence. To our left, the River Eon continues to parallel us, and it'll swap to the right-hand side in a couple of hundred yards or so. Just before the bridge, you can see the point where the Whitehaven, Cleator and Egremont Railway diverge to the right. The southern section of this line was also called the Cleator and Furness Railway because of its shared ownership. The track served stations at Bekermot, Egremont, Wood End and Woor Row before rejoining the Furness Railway at Mirehouse Junction just south of the tunnel under Church Hill to the station at Whitehaven, our final destination today. We're about 20 minutes from there now. This line is surely one of the hidden gems of the rail network. It is simultaneously a busy and important commuter route, a strategic freight line, and as we're seeing in perfect weather today, a beautiful and intimate exploration of some of Cumbria's most attractive coastline. In a moment, the river will leave us and we'll be running on a narrow area of land just above the beach. Directly in front of us is the headland at St. Bees, which presents a major obstacle to our progress and forces the railway inland up the valley of Powbeck. To our right, we can see the raised area, which is likely the beginning of the St. Bees moraine. Moraines were formed at the extremity of a glacier, where the ice had scraped debris from the landscape it was moving across and pushed it ahead of its progress. When glacial movement stopped, it left a small ridge of this material at that point, and this is what's called the moraine. Amongst other contents, this one is composed of boulders, small stones and clay, and is the reason that the railway around here is regularly troubled by land slippage. We're now approaching the request stop at Braystones, but we won't be stopping there today. This area, like the next request stop at Nethertown, is a popular seaside holiday destination. The cabins on the beach to our left are greatly sought after, and there are also 2 large caravan parks on the higher ground to the right. This beach must be everyone's idea of the perfect place to stroll and listen to the sounds of the waves, and enjoys unobstructed views across the water to Scotland and the Isle of Man. A moment ago we passed a 50-mile-an-hour limit, but now there's a warning of a temporary 20-mile-an-hour one ahead. We're approaching the first of 2 sections which have been affected by parts of the track bed being washed away. It's not entirely an unusual occurrence around here, and with the track being situated on a shelf carved into the moraine, the potential for the ground moving is high when there's adverse weather. Listen to the beat of the train's wheels hitting the joints in the track, and it's obvious that we're slowing markedly. There's the start of the 20 zone, and you'll see the large rocks on the left ahead, which have been put into place to rebuild the drop to the beach below where it was washed away. This was a serious collapse, but there's another one, much larger, a short distance ahead. We pass the yellow marker, which shows we've reached the end of the speed restriction, and the driver adds power to accelerate. Here, the track slices through a section of the moraine to cut the corner of the small outcrop ahead. And we can see another group of small holiday cottages on the promontory above us, enjoying the spectacular view out across the sea. We approach another yellow sign, This one warns of a temporary track crossing ahead. And in response, our driver removes the power and we're coasting. Around here, you'll identify work that's been done from the different coloured stone in the track ballast and in the drainage channels on the slopes. The access here was to allow for the repair of the track bed around this bend. And once we pass it, there's a warning of the next 20-mile-an-hour zone. The buildings on the beach here are more substantial than the huts we passed earlier, and one even has a roof full of photovoltaic cells. The beach has changed its nature and is now covered in pebbles and stones rather than sand as before. This may be because of the effect of the debris pushed by the moraine to our right. Ahead, engineers have worked hard to build a retaining wall to hold the track foundations in place and protect them from the sea. We're approaching the landslip now and will enter the 20-mile-an-hour zone in a moment. Again, look for the different colours of ballast to see where work has been carried out. At about 7 a.m. on the 30th of August 2012, a southbound two-car diesel multiple unit derailed here when the banks at the concrete blocks ahead collapsed across the line. A second train was sent to rescue the passengers and take them to a reception centre set up by the emergency services at Sellafield. But it too became stuck, and in the end the passengers walked from the train to Nethertown Station, where they were collected. We've now passed the yellow sign that signals the end of the speed restriction, and we can accelerate back up to line speed. Along here it's set at 60 miles an hour. The section of concrete seawall appears on the left, along with a line of white boulders to protect it from the waves. The high water mark is very close to the railway along this stretch. Ahead, St. Bees Head looms large, its red sandstone cliffs standing out against the clear blue sky. And in front we can see the waves breaking on the sandy beach of the protected bay, which attracts so many holidaymakers. St. Bees Head is remarkable for a number of reasons. It's the most westerly point on Cumbria and is the only area of high cliffs between Wales and Scotland. It presents an obstacle to the railway's passage, but the railway presented an opportunity to exploit the stone through an easy method of transport. The track turns inland and we say goodbye to this beautiful stretch of coastline. We're 5 miles from our destination at Whitehaven, and between here and there we'll be travelling up the valley of Powell Beck and finally through a tunnel under the town. But before that, we have a stop at St. Bees Station, and we're already beginning to slow for the platform. The population here is only 1,700, yet nearly 50,000 people a year use the station. A part of the reason may be that Wainwright's coast-to-coast walk begins here, leading travellers from the Irish Sea to the North Sea at Robin Hood's Bay, and the railway is a convenient way of reaching the starting point. As we round the bend, the station comes into sight, along with the passing loop for the southbound platform. On the right, we'll see the remains of the goods yard, which handled the exports of sandstone, along with production from Walker's Scone Flour Works and Pickle Factory, and the end-of-term baggage from the renowned St. Bees School. We'll see some of its day pupils on the platforms. There's a signal box by the level crossing, and the signalman is standing on the platform awaiting our arrival. He's here to exchange tokens with the driver, taking from him the token for the single-track section we've just passed through and giving him the one for the section ahead. As they exchange the tokens, the driver tells the signalman that we're watching him at work today, but at least he seems relaxed about it. So with token in hand, the signalman makes his way back to his box. Both home signals are already set to clear, the one for the level crossing and a second one at the curve which guards the entrance to the single-track section of line. We've a fair number of passengers to disembark and board, but no one is taking their time and the doors thud closed very quickly. Before long, we'll be off again. A fair amount of traffic has built up at the level crossing during our time at the platform, and leading the way is a horse from the local stables who seems singularly unimpressed by the train. We enter the single-track section again, and our next stop is at Corkicle. The station opened in 1855 after passenger trains began operating through the Corkicle or Branstey Tunnel under Whitehaven, which connected the tracks of the Whitehaven Junction Railway with those of the Whitehaven and Furness Junction Railway. We'll be there in about 5 minutes. But firstly, we have to work our way around the hillside to our left, the eastern edge of St. Bees Head. Parbeck lies across to the right and runs with us for the next mile or so. Ahead on the left is Abbey Wood, within sight of St. Bees Priory behind us. Carved stones found there hint at the settlement's founders, providing evidence of an Irish-Norse Viking presence in the 10th century. The name St. Bees is said to have come from an Irish princess, St. Bega, who fled her homeland to escape an enforced marriage to a Viking chieftain. A Benedictine priory was established here in the 12th century and existed until its dissolution by Henry VIII in 1559. Remarkably, two men who grew up together in St. Bees held high office in the church at the same time. Edmund Grindal became Archbishop of Canterbury and Edwin Sandys Archbishop of York. Our destination at Whitehaven is getting close. The town was part of a reversal of roles in the 16th century. Until then, St. Bees was the dominant settlement in the area, and the priory there owned a small coastal village. But with the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in 1539, Whitehaven was able to determine its own future. The Industrial Revolution played its part in developing Whitehaven into a coal-exporting port, second in importance only to Newcastle. The Larder family played an important role in this transformation of the town, building a stone pier in 1634 for the loading and unloading of goods. But Whitehaven is also renowned for an incident during the American War of Independence. John Paul Jones, born across the Solway in southwest Scotland, knew the town well, having regularly sailed from there in ships plying their trade across the Atlantic. In 1778, he carried out an attack on the town, with the intention of setting fire to the more than 200 ships moored in the harbour. In the end, it was a pretty incompetent operation, since the lanterns he'd intended to use to start the fires had run out of fuel. His men also appeared to break off from their attack to visit the local pub. And so, although the event is commemorated as one of the more exciting moments in Whitehaven's history, it can't really be said that Jones posed any threat to the people of the town. We've just passed the northern junction with the Whitehaven, Cleator and Egremont Railway. It left us back at Sellafield. And ahead there are two more rail lines in quick succession just before we reach the next station at Corkicle. The first is the Corkicle Brake, an inclined wagonway built to transport coal from the Earl of Lonsdale's Croft Pit to the west of here. The siding associated with it is on our left now, and it remained in use until 1986. The second line departs to the left where we curve gently to the right. And in fact, the old line leads to the original Whitehaven terminus of the Whitehaven and Furness Junction Railway at Preston Street Station. The through connection to tracks northwards was made with the opening of the Corkicle Tunnel in 1852. And 2 years later, the Furness Railway, which had bought the Whitehaven and Furness Junction, began using the station we now simply know as Whitehaven. The platform at Corkicle appears around the bend. This is our penultimate stop. At the far end of the platform is the tunnel under the town which connects to the station beyond, and we'll be on the platform there as soon as we exit from the northern portal. Above us, unseen as we emerge, is yet another railway. In fact, it's one of the first to be built. The wagonway employed ironclad wooden rails to transport coal from William Pitt to the harbour. We're less than a mile now from our destination, and for the majority of that distance we'll be underground. And perhaps it's fitting that we conclude the journey that way, experiencing the darkness that surrounded the men who made the communities along the length of the Cumbria coastline from Barrow-in-Furness to Whitehaven the industrial centres they became in the 19th century. And many of them gave their lives in doing so. Over a period of 300 years, more than 70 pits were sunk around Whitehaven and 500 people died as a result of accidents. The biggest loss was at Wellington Pit in 1910, when 136 men lost their lives. 110 died in 1946 at William Pit, and 83 in 4 separate explosions across a decade at Hague Pit. The platform begins at the tunnel exit, and there's the start of the 15-mile-an-hour limit through the station. But for us, this journey is over. We've travelled between 2 of Cumbria's great communities along a railway line set among spectacular scenery which belies its industrial past. And we're here at our destination in Whitehaven. Thank you for joining us on this trip along the Cumbria coastline from Barrow to Whitehaven, and we hope you'll be inspired to make the journey for yourself. Next time on Journeys, we travel to Wales for a trip on the world's oldest narrow-gauge steam railway, taking us through spectacular scenery climbing 700 feet in just 13.5 miles. That's the Festiniog Railway next time on Journeys.